Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be great. We're going to be back in the book of James. We're going to be looking at another theme, another major lesson that runs through his writings. Today we're going to be looking at this theme of possessions, wealth, material things. And so whether it's talking about rich or poor or gold or nice clothing, this theme runs through James numerous times, and it kind of connects the book of James in several ways, and it will even overlap some other themes, and I'll kind of try to show that as we go through that those our study today. I want to begin, though, first of all, in the Gospel of Matthew. When I began this a few weeks ago, we talked about the fact that James has a lot of similarities to the lessons, the sermons of Jesus Christ, specifically the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. And so it's very possible that James was kind of using some of Jesus' sermons as a jump-off point to then expand upon Jesus' teachings. Let's look real quickly at Matthew chapter 6 in a text we're probably familiar with. Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." So Jesus begins by explaining that these types of treasures that are physical, material things, he says, they're not going to last, right? The moth, the rust, the thieves break in and steal. You ever had that shirt or that jacket that you love so much and you first wear it and you look good in that shirt and you're like, man, I'm killing it, right? You feel really good about that shirt. And after a amount of time, maybe you don't look as good as you used to, but sometimes the shirt just starts to fade. It starts to wear out because these things that we enjoy, these things that are physical possessions, no matter what, they don't last forever. They start to wear down, moth, rust. It doesn't matter what things you have. If they're physical, they won't last. So Jesus says, don't lay up things like this, right? Because they're temporary. He has this contrasting command. Then this is a command. All triple underlines here. It's an imperative verb. It's a verb of command. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Those things don't destroy your treasures in heaven. So then he again reminds them that where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. If the things you treasure most are here on earth, that's where your heart will be. So why would you long to go to heaven? Why would you long for the next life if the things you treasure are here? So we need to lay up our treasures somewhere else. He then talks about the eye is the lamp of the body. So the eye here, meaning how you view wealth, how you view treasures, kind of an Old Testament image. But how do you view money? But then he returns. So again, it's kind of sandwiched in between what's clearly money. And so that's, again, referring to money and how you view it. Verse 24, no one can serve two masters. You can't serve God and money. So Jesus, again, speaks on money. He speaks on wealth and possessions. And when you look at the ministry of Jesus Christ, did he elevate people that were wealthy or rich or had possessions? He did not. In fact, he frequently gave very serious warnings about those with a lot of money. Here again, you can't serve God and money. We have, his discussion with the rich young ruler. You're lacking one thing, go and sell what you have and give it to the poor. The eye of the needle. Lots of teachings were given by Jesus concerning the dangerous aspects of having money, which is interesting because in James chapter 1, as James begins his discussion on wealth and possessions, he uses this idea of possessions in his discussion of trials, right? When you have a trial, back to verse 1, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you have trials," various kinds of trials. Well, what is having no money, can being poor be a trial? Absolutely. Wondering where you're going to pay your bills, wondering how you're going to make ends meet, that's a trial. Can having money be a trial? Absolutely. And so money, possessions, wealth, either having it or not having it, can be a trial. And so it's interesting that in the midst of his discussion on trials, he discusses the aspect of having possessions. He says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and let the rich in his humiliation. Why? Because like the flower of the grass, he will pass. Just like Jesus talks about, right? It's going to rust, it's going to destroy, it's not going to last. So James again highlights the same thing Jesus does, that it's not going to last. Let the lowly brother, so the brother of humble circumstances. And so I gave my own translation of this, and this is kind of how I translated that. But boast, brothers, of humble circumstances in your high position. Well, what high position should you boast in? Well, what about the fact that you are a brother in the family of God? You can boast about the fact that you are a child of God. So let the lowly brother boast. And so here again is an imperative verb, a verb of command, triple underline. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich boast in his humiliation, because it's going to fade away. So in the book of James, he talks about the rich. And so there's a discussion amongst scholars. Is the rich in his writings brothers in the church? Is it the rich of the community? Perhaps there's some crossover here. So let's say for a moment that the rich here are the rich in the church, Christian brothers. What should they boast in? They should boast in the fact that there's a self-realization. They understand that their wealth is temporary. And so because of that, they don't put their, that's not where their treasure is, right? So they might be boasting in the temporary nature. And really, so the idea is it's really nothing to boast in physically, is it? So, but maybe the Christian brother is boasting in the fact that he, self-realization, he's aware of these things. I understand these are a temporary blessing. Perhaps the wealthy then is also, maybe it's the wealthy of the world. And so again, if that's the case, probably James is being sarcastic here. While there is a tendency for the rich to boast, let him boast in this. His wealth is like grass. He's like grass. Well, that's not really anything to boast in, is it? So that perhaps is, again, sarcasm. I'm not sure exactly. But again, look at the summary here of verse 11. The sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flowers falls, its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And I want to kind of draw your attention to this phrase. We'll look at it again in a minute. But the rich man, in the midst of his pursuits, in the midst of his business dealings, he's going to fade away. These things are temporary. Let's go to chapter 2 real quick, and we're not going to spend a lot of time there because we've already kind of talked about this last week in our discussion on the theme of judging and partiality. But James does talk again about showing no partiality. And again, we talked about this. James brings up a point, and then he illustrates that point. That's a common way that James lays out his letter. So the point here is, my brothers, here's the point. Don't show partiality as you hold your faith. As you have your Christian walk, don't show partiality. How does he illustrate partiality? By talking about, again, possessions, wealth. A man has a good clothes, he comes in and you treat him one way. A man who comes in with poor clothes and you treat him another way. Then he says in verse 4, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So what do I want you to take from this? We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because we talked about it a little bit last week, or quite a bit last week. But what are the observations that I want you to recall from last time and even from right here? First of all, when we mistreat people, when we are judges, and again, specifically, he uses the illustration of judging those who do not have, they're poor. He says, you have become judges with evil thoughts, verse 4. What else does he say that we should remember in this moment? God cares, verse 5. God has chosen those who are poor. So we see God's care for the poor. We see that when we mistreat the poor, we are having evil thoughts. We can come down to verse 6, and he says, when you've done this, you've dishonored the poor man. We come down to verse 9, and he says, if you do this, showing partiality against the poor, he says, you are committing sin. Man, these are some pretty heavy things to consider. It's evil. You're dishonoring them. It's sin. By the way, God cares for them, verse 5. James calls his reader here in verse 8 to fulfill the royal law as it applies to all people, but specifically in this context, certainly as it applies to the poor who were being judged by these Christians. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, what do? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If a person comes into the church and a person is coming in and he has his bag on his shoulder and he looks rough and he smells bad and he looks dirty and he's gross, do we have a tendency to judge that person? Do we have a tendency to look down on that person? Do they not fit with our idea of what a person should look like? And so have we ever been guilty of this? Have we ever been guilty of looking at a person who enters into our assembly? And are we ever guilty of the same things James writes about in James chapter 2? A man with shabby clothes comes in and he's dirty and he smells, and we don't treat him with the same love as another guy comes in and he's clean and he has maybe his Bible with him and his family with him. And we say to that person, oh, it's so great to have you. Are we not guilty of being evil judges, mistreating people based off of possessions, based off of what they don't have? And I know I have fallen into this trap. I have been guilty of this. I have oftentimes in my life excused, myself from not helping some. And again, it's hard, right? But I've done this. I've been guilty of saying, well, they're abusing drugs. They're doing this. They're making their own choices. And certainly that is true of a lot. But does that mean that I shouldn't care for the poor? Does that mean I shouldn't do what I can, what lies within my ability to try to love, to try to show, and whether it's poor or not? And again, I didn't go back to this, but let's hop back to James chapter 1. So here he is. He's talking about these poor that come in dirty clothes. But if you back up to the last part of chapter 1, what does James say as he ends that chapter? Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Weren't they outcasts? Weren't they poor? And so James here, he then he moves right from his discussion of orphans and widows to those who were coming into the church dressed in poor attire. In the ministry of Jesus Christ, outcasts were a huge part of his ministry. The poor, the sinners, the outcasts who were even wealthy, the tax collectors. James also cares for the outcasts. He talks about orphans. He talks about widows. He talks about poor. And so we need to remember that in the mind of James, the ministry of Jesus Christ, care for the outcasts, care for the poor, care for the widows, the orphans, that is a huge part of the ministry that Jesus Christ lived. It is a huge part of the ministry, the faith that James calls us to have. And so we come back to the book of James and we go back to chapter 2. So we have, again, this aspect of perhaps wealth and possessions being here reflected in chapter 1. Certainly it, again, is seen in chapter 2. And then James is going to bring up another major theme in his writings, this theme of faith and works. Now, we're not going to talk about that theme just yet, but mingled into this theme, James has another, he again blends this faith and works theme with our current theme. Again, this theme of possessions, wealth. And again, look real quickly what he says here in verses 14 through 17. He says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him?" So again, this point illustration pattern of in James's writings, right? What is the point? James is going to talk about faith and works. How does he illustrate faith and works? Well, one of the ways he illustrates it several ways, but one of the ways is, again, through possessions, wealth. Look at what he says. "What good is it, my brother, if someone says," and I want to draw your attention real quickly to this. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but in the book of James, James does a lot with what we say versus what we do. What we say is one thing. I claim to be this, but what do our actions reflect? So he says he has faith. Can that kind of a thing, if you speak but don't act, can that kind of a faith be a good faith? Is it an active faith? Is it a complete faith? He then uses an illustration to make his point. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed, so again, we see this aspect of possession and wealth. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed, they're lacking in daily food, and one of you says, so he doesn't provide anything, he speaks to them, he says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and be filled," and doesn't give. He doesn't give it the things that are needy. Look at this question. This is a powerful question. What good is that? What good is that? Brothers and sisters, if we talk about all the time that we need to care for those who are lost, if we need to care for those who are hurting, if we need to care for the poor, the outcast, the orphan, the widow. We have widows in our church. Do you? We have orphans in our community. Do you? Are we caring for them? We have poor in our community. Do you? Or what are we doing for them? How are we reaching out to them? How are we trying to bless them? Or are we simply speaking our Christianity? If one says to them, "Go and be warmed and be filled," and does not give him the things that are needed, look again at James' question. What good is that? What good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. So James, again, in his theme of faith and works, ties in this theme of wealth and possession. And he illustrates this aspect of what we say versus what we do. Very important Take note of that. Let's hop down to chapter 4. And this one might be a little more subtle, I suppose, to see this aspect of wealth and possession, but we'll try to tie it in. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring." So notice this phrase, trade and make a profit. I want to take you back real quickly to chapter 1, verse 11. He says, "So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits." So the sun rises a scorching heat. You're like grass. Notice all of these phrases that I want you to see them. He talks about the temporary nature, flowers, grass that fades, its beauty perishes. So the rich man will fade away in the midst of his pursuits. I'm going to highlight that word pursuits. Okay, I want you to see that word. In the midst of his pursuits, this businessman he's trying to make his wealth. He's a wealthy businessman. In the midst of his pursuits, he will fade away. So here we have that same word used twice. James only uses that word 3 times in his little letter here. He uses it in chapter 1, verse 11. He uses it again here in chapter 4. "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we're going to do our pursuits, our business pursuits. We're going to go into such and such a town and we're going to do our business pursuits and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring." What is your life? Your life is like a mist. It appears, it vanishes. Is that not similar to the aspect of the grass and the flowers that fade? Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this. We will live and do this or that. So the guilty here, the wealthy businessman, tying back into chapter 1, verse 11 here with chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. The wealthy businessman who trusted in himself, trusted in his possessions, trusted in his pursuits, their wealth, they don't consider God in their plans. So there is this aspect of the wealthy, and they're guilty. And what are they guilty of? Those who are wealth-oriented, possession-seeking people, they have a tendency to not include God in their plans. Is that a trial to have wealth, to have this possession-oriented mindset? Is it a trial? Is it a test? If we don't consider God in our life? Let's go to one last text in the book of James where he will talk about possessions and wealth again. Here in chapter 5, and he gives a very strong warning to the wealthy. So I want you again to see that's who he's speaking to, the rich here. And again, showing that wealth can be a trial. He gives 3 imperative verbs here. Here's an imperative verb, here's an imperative verb, and right here. So come, weep, and behold. So I think the come and the behold are really trying to just get the attention of the rich. So he's trying to get their attention. Very, a strong call to pay attention. What does he tell them to do as he calls them? He really gives them a warning. But what is the command? The command is weep. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl." Why? "For the miseries coming upon you." Does that sound like a trial? Is wealth a trial? "Your riches have rotted." Isn't that similar to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6? "Your garments are moth-eaten." Isn't that similar to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6? "Your gold and your silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidenced against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last days." So then they were also dishonest. "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your field, which you have kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvester have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." A military term for God. The military term, God hears their cries. "You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence." Man, this is harsh. "You have fattened your hearts in the days of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." 3 imperative verbs, but he calls them to weep. Why weep? "For the miseries of judgment that are coming upon you." Your wealth is going to fail. You've laid up treasures in the wrong place. You've been dishonest. You've withheld wages. You've condemned the righteous. And God has heard the cries of those. Do we have wisdom to see wealth as a trial? Again, as James began this in James chapter 1, he says, if any of you are having, going through wisdom, he says, going through trials, if you lack wisdom for what? Handling these trials, ask of God. Do we have the wisdom to see wealth as a trial? Here it seems that James is speaking to the wealthy who do not have the wisdom to see that wealth is a trial. He's speaking to the wealthy who have trusted in earthly riches. Verse 2, verse 3, verse 5. They've gained some of their wealth by mistreatment of the poor. Does James paint wealth as something of great importance, as something to boast about? In the book of James, just like being poor, being wealthy can be a trial. Possessions can be a trial. The Apostle Paul even warns us that love is the root of all kinds of evil in 1 Timothy 6. I'm really struck with this phrase here. Your gold and your silver have corroded. They're corrosion. Why have they corroded? Because you've stuck your possessions in your treasure chest, right? They're sitting there. You're not using them. There's all those people around you. They need them, but you're just stockpiling them. And I cannot help but be convicted by this myself and maybe convict you by this. But how many of us have so many possessions? We go out and literally rent storage units to hold our possessions so that we can stick them there, so that they can corrode and waste away to nothing while there's needy all around us. Are we not guilty to some degree of this? Your gold and your silver corroded. They're going to be evidence against us because we're not helping people, because we're instead paying money to store our possessions. I'm not saying that you are, and I'm not, man, I don't know what to do with this all the time entirely. This is a hard thing. We are so wealthy in this country. We have so many possessions. And again, if it's that difficult for us to go into, to prioritize God's kingdom, to prioritize Christ, does it not take wisdom to do this, to properly balance wealth and our faith? Does it not take wisdom? Is it not a trial? Is it not a test? Just like being poor can be a test. What does James say about the poor? He encourages them to have the wisdom to boast in something more important. There's things more important than wealth. Boast in that you are a brother, that you have a high position in Christ. And then he also, I think, is warning the poor, don't desire that what they have so badly. He reminds them that being rich is not necessarily a good thing. Wealth brings all sorts of other trials. What does he say about the wealthy? Well, he has a lot to say about the wealthy. Many of them have gained their wealth in improper ways. They've mistreated the poor. They have failed to use their wealth, right? Man, that is a tough one. You have failed to use your wealth. You've laid up treasures. You failed to use your wealth to help the needy. You've withheld wages. You've not cared for those who were lacking. What's the most important? What are the most important things? What are some of those more important things? Caring for the widow and the orphan. And he cautions them to find humility in their wealth, knowing that their wealth is temporary, like flowers. There's a few critical lessons that are very important for us, for sure, in the book of James. The care for the needy, the care for the outcast in the Christian community. That's got to be a part of who we are. We can't just speak Christianity. We can't just say Christian things. Christian community has to be about helping those in need, about helping the outcast. Has to be about a part of our Christian faith. Jesus cared for the outcast. He cared for the injustices done to the poor. He cared for those who had little to nothing. James, his brother, does and says and reflects the same types of convictions. We as a Christian, as churches, as individuals, as churches, and both churches and individuals, we need to be looking and evaluating and asking, what are we doing? Can we do more? Should we do more? And I don't know, maybe you're doing great. Second lesson, and again, it's a critical lesson, is the dangers of wealth in the book of James. Wealth needs to be understood and viewed with wisdom. Wealth needs to be understood that it is a difficult thing. It needs to be understood with wisdom. It takes wisdom to understand that wealth provides a difficult challenge to have our faith properly placed in Christ. And again, as Jesus Christ said in Matthew chapter 6, which we began with, you cannot serve God and money. There are certainly lessons for us. Be about helping. Find ways that you can help. Do something within your own church. Find something within your own community. Do it as an individual. Do it as a group. How can we care for those who are hurting in our community? Have a good day. God bless.